If you will, turn in your Bibles to John, the Gospel of John, chapter 18. We're going to finish that chapter out today and then go part of the way through chapter 19. What we're looking at today, beginning in verse 39, is the character Pilate. We were introduced to him last week, and he's the governor of Judea at the time of Jesus. And one of the important things to know and understand about Pilate is only Pilate, in this Roman world, only Pilate has the authority to authorize executions. So the Jews, although they can govern themselves largely the daily affairs of their own nation, but they cannot execute anyone. And that's important because the Jewish people want Jesus dead. The Jewish leaders do anyway. They want Jesus dead. And so they take Jesus to Pilate and they say, "We want you to kill this guy." And Pilate says, "Well, what has he done?" And they say, well, and they had these trumped up charges. They say, well, he's calling himself a king, and that's subversive to Rome. And but the part that's really interesting there is that's not actually what Jesus was charged with. He was charged with blasphemy, but the Jewish people know that the Romans won't execute Jesus on the charge of blasphemy. They don't care about those religious arguments. But insurrection, now that's a crime they'll execute him for. So they say he's calling himself a king. Now Pilate sees right through this. He's reluctant to execute Jesus. The entire story, we'll see that reluctance today too. He's reluctant to execute Jesus, but the problem is he's being blackmailed. The Jewish people know that they can write to Caesar about Pilate and likely get him fired, removed from his post. So he's kind of between a rock and a hard spot, and that's where we open up today. Chapter 18 and verse 39, we open up to Pilate speaking. He goes out to the Jews and he says, "But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the king of the Jews?" So they cried out again, saying, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. You know, at Thanksgiving time, you've probably seen this. At Thanksgiving time, there is a tradition at the White House where the president will pardon a turkey. Have you seen that? He'll pardon a turkey so that turkey doesn't end up as someone's Thanksgiving dinner. And it's a neat little ceremony, right? It's intended to endear the people to their president. There's something like this going on in Israel here, where Pilate wants to endear the people to himself. So he has this custom, this tradition, where during the Passover he'll release one of their prisoners to be free, to be set back into the Jewish community. And Pilate, being reluctant to execute Jesus, he really doesn't want to, he comes up with a plan. The plan is, well, I'll just make sure that Jesus is the one that we're releasing, that we're letting go. And so he comes out and he says to the people, here's the custom. It's Passover. I'm going to release one of the criminals. I'm going to release this one you call the king of the Jews. And they say, no. No, we want Barabbas. Barabbas. Now, we don't know a lot about Barabbas, but we do know from Luke's gospel that he is a real criminal. He's convicted of treason, of murder, and of robbery. We know these things to be true. Interestingly, he may be a sort of a comfortable felon of sorts, a likable criminal, something like Robin Hood, perhaps, or Batman, a vigilante acting for justice outside the law. But he nonetheless has killed people. He nonetheless has stolen, even if it is trying to fight the Roman occupation. It's nonetheless true that Barabbas is guilty of murder and of rebelling against a legitimate government and of stealing. None of those things was Jesus guilty of. Barabbas was. And what's interesting here is that Jesus becomes the substitute for Barabbas. I wonder what happens. We can't know this. It's not written in the scriptures. But I wonder what happens to Barabbas once he's released. I wonder if Barabbas follows Jesus. As Jesus carries the cross on his back up the hill of Calvary, the cross that should have been his. I wonder if Barabbas watched as they drove the nails into Jesus' hands and his feet. And I wonder if Barabbas realized that those should have been his hands and his feet. I wonder if Barabbas watched that day as Jesus suffered in agony and died, knowing that instead of Jesus, it should have been him. It should have been Barabbas on that cross. I wonder even more, if you realize it, that it should have been you on that cross. I wonder if Barabbas looked at Jesus that day that he died and swelled up with some sort of gratitude for all that Jesus did to step in at that time and at that place to take his spot. Maybe you know how he feels. Maybe you too feel the gratitude of Jesus stepping in and taking your spot there on that cross. Unfortunately, this plan to release Jesus didn't work out. They preferred Barabbas. And so now Pilate has to resort to a plan B of sorts, and we'll see that plan B as we read on. Let's look at verses 1 to 5. Chapter 19, verses 1 to 5. Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and give him slaps in the face. Pilate came out again, and he said to them, "Behold, I'm bringing him out to you so that you may know I find no guilt in him." Jesus then came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So when the chief priest and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." I think that this second plan that Pilate comes up with, it goes something like this. He's thinking in his mind, okay, they didn't let me release him just scot-free, so I've got to do something. I don't want to crucify this man because I can tell that he's innocent. Pilate even declares it there. But he thinks maybe if I can have him scourged, that is, whipped and beaten, then maybe the crowds, the Jews, will look at him and say, okay, he's been punished enough. Now he can go. And so Pilate has Jesus whipped and beaten, but obviously it's not enough. Now, before I move on too quickly here, I want to point something out that's going on in these verses. Jesus is being made a mockery of. His charge is the King of the Jews. And so what do the soldiers do? These soldiers don't really know what's going on. They're probably not even from Jerusalem. They're probably imported just for the sake of the Passover. They're here for a short stay. And here's this criminal. Supposedly the King of the Jews. They know nothing more than that. But they take this opportunity to have their own twisted fun. And they make fun of Jesus. Oh, hail, King of the Jews. And they take these thorns and they twist it into a crown, a mock crown, and they put it on his head. And they give him these purple robes, the color of royalty, and they drape it over his shoulders. And they kick him, and they beat him, and they punch him. But what's interesting is that beneath all the mockery, many commentators throughout church history have pointed this out, beneath all the mockery, there's truth there. They're mocking him as a king, but the truth is, he is a king. He's the King of kings and the Lord of lords. So that even through their mockery, they are in some strange way testifying to a reality. Verses 6 to 9. Again, I'll read 6 and keep going. So when the chief priest and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify! Crucify!" And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered into the praetorium and again said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So for these verses, I want to take a look at three different responses that we've seen in these verses. The Jewish people's response, and Pilate's response, and then finally Jesus' response. When the Jewish people respond here, they hear Pilate come out and declare, I find him innocent. They give the real reason. They can't let Jesus get off. They can't. So they give the Pilate yet another charge. The actual charge that he was charged with initially in the Jewish court. They say that this man claims to be God. He claims to be the Son of God. Notice that is not a political charge. It's a theological charge. And I think a lot of the division that we face in this country, on the surface, it looks like it's political. Right? But I don't think that the divisions that we are experiencing in this country, I don't think that they're fundamentally political divisions. It doesn't matter whether you're left or right or red or blue. It's not going to make you a sinner or a saint regarding which party you vote for. I think the real issue is theological. It's about what we understand to be true of God, that he exists, that there is a God in the first place even. What we know to be true about the nature of humanity. What we know to be true about justice in a society. These are not fundamentally political issues. These are fundamentally theological issues. Theological issues. And because we are on such different worldviews, we see the splintering and the fracturing of society. Jesus was charged initially in the Jewish court with a theological crime, claiming to be God. And against Pilate in the secular world, he was charged with a political crime, but that was really not the crime. What really was the crime was the theological. And so is it true today, too. The political stuff is just the surface. What we're really getting at in society is a theological issue. The second person I want to look at here in these verses is Pilate. Plan A didn't work. He wanted to release Jesus. They refused. They wanted Barabbas instead. Plan B, to punish Jesus and then let him go, well, that didn't work either. And so Pilate has to resort here to a plan C, if you will. He says, take him yourselves and crucify him. Of course, we know that Pilate doesn't actually intend for them to do that. He knows they can't do that, and he wouldn't even let them because he's the governor. He alone has that authority. But it shows us the frustration that's emerging within Pilate. He's so frustrated with this situation. He wants to do what's right, but he's also so connected to his power. He can't let that go. He's afraid to crucify Jesus, actually. Did you see that in verse 8? It said that Pilate was afraid. He was afraid. And what made him afraid? Well, that real charge that the Jews gave him, that he claimed to be the Son of God, that frightened Pilate. Now, Pilate was a Roman, which means he was probably, if he was religious at all, he was probably a pagan. And the pagan Roman religion, the pagan Roman theology had many different gods. In fact, most of our planets in our solar system are named after Roman gods. And so he had this understanding that there are these gods. And the belief in the Roman world was that sometimes, on occasion, these gods would intermingle with human beings. And sometimes they would even have offspring with humans. And so Pilate entertains this possibility that perhaps Jesus is who he claims to be, that he is some sort of god or demigod. And in fact, we get that impression even more as we look into what Pilate says next. He comes up to Jesus and he says, "Where are you from?" Now Pilate knows where he's from. He knows that he is from Nazareth. He's Jesus the Nazarene. And so what he's asking here is not, what country are you from or what city are you from? He's saying, are you from heaven? What are your origins? Are you a god? He's scared. He's scared that he may be, in fact, about to crucify a god. In fact, he is. But Jesus is silent, which leads us to Jesus' response. Jesus is silent with Pilate and makes us wonder at least a little bit why. You know, I'm a big proponent, you obviously know, I'm a big proponent of sharing the gospel. I think you ought to share the gospel everywhere you go. Wherever you are, whoever you're with, whenever it is, you should share the gospel at all times. Be ready to give an account for the hope that's in you. However, there are times when people have such different worldviews and hearts that are so absolutely stubborn that to continue to persistently share the gospel with a particular person, it may lead to more arguments and fruitless efforts with certain people who have just shown themselves to be absolutely closed off because of the way they see the world. We have a saying in our culture, it's called beating your head against the wall, right? Some people are like this. And they will never change unless the Holy Spirit significantly moves their heart. Jesus said it this way in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, "Don't throw your pearls before swine." That's what I think is happening here. Jesus understands that Pilate's priority is power. And the one thing that threatens his power is if he lets Jesus go. He knows that Pilate's just not going to let that happen. So there's nothing left to say. Jesus is silent before Pilate. Let's continue in verses 10 to 12. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me. Do you not know that I have the authority to release you, and I have the authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." So finally, Pilate gets Jesus to speak, but he doesn't speak in his own defense. Instead, he speaks on the issue of authority. Pilate claims to have authority over Jesus, and Jesus makes the point that no one has authority that's not first and ultimately given from God. Everything that happens, even at the hands of wicked men, everything that happens by the authority of God. That's what it means to be sovereign. That God is in control of every aspect of human activity. God had the cross planned from the beginning. The cross wasn't plan B. It wasn't like God had a different rescue plan and we humans messed it up and so we had to resort to the cross. No, the cross was the plan from the beginning, and God unfolded his plan even at the hands of wicked men such as Pilate. Everything happens by the authority of God. Now, was the cross what we expected? No, it certainly wasn't. Who would imagine a crucified Messiah? No, we wouldn't think of that on our own. And yet it is the exact way that God planned to redeem sinners. You know, this happens for our governments too. All of our governments derive their power ultimately and finally from God. Any government that exists on the face of the planet. Both good governments and, friends, bad governments. They all derive their authority from God. As we speak here this morning, Vladimir Putin is invading Ukraine and he is murdering innocent Ukrainians. And he's doing so by the authority of God. Now, does that mean that he's correct in doing it? Absolutely not. In fact, I would argue that it is terribly sinful what he's doing. But nonetheless, all authority is given from God. Is it sinful for what Vladimir Putin is doing, invading and killing innocent Ukrainians? Absolutely it is. But guess what? It was also sinful for Pilate to crucify the Son of God. And yet, it was part of his plan. It was part of his plan. Only God knows how to unfold the events of human history, and he does so sovereignly. Now, I will say this, I believe that leaders will be held to a higher standard. When we average citizens, when we get in trouble with the law, well, we just get punished by the state, right? But who punishes the state when they're unjust? God does. God does. Whether in this life or the next, God will bring punishment upon rulers who have a miscarriage of their justice, who have a miscarriage of the power that they've been given authority to wield. So Proverbs 17 verse 15 says this, "He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous, both of them alike are an abomination to the Lord." Let me read that again. "He who justifies the wicked and he who condemns the righteous, both of them alike are an abomination to the Lord." That's a strong word, isn't it? And it's not something that most of us can just happen into. Most of us don't have the ability to justify anybody or to condemn anybody, but rulers do. And those who misuse that power, just like Pilate here, are called an abomination to the Lord. That's exactly what Pilate does. Did you know that? He justified the wicked. He let Barabbas go. And he condemned the righteous by sentencing Jesus. An abomination to the Lord. In this life or next, they'll be punished. Chapter 19, verses 13 to 16. The last verses we'll see today. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat, a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold, your king." So they cried out, "Away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priest answered, "We have no king but Caesar." First of all, I want to look at the imagery of these verses. The imagery of these verses, in this verb where Pilate comes out and sits in the judgment seat, it can be rendered from the Greek either as transitive or intransitive, which means that it could read this way. When Pilate heard these words, he brought out Jesus and had him sit in the judgment seat. So it would be Pilate having Jesus be seated rather than Pilate himself being seated in the seat. I think that what's going on here, if this is true, is this is one last attempt by Pilate to get the Jews to see that this man doesn't need to be crucified. So we have this image of Jesus. He's got this crown of thorns sticking into his head and blood dripping down from where the thorns have pierced him. He's got 2 black eyes from the soldiers beating him. He's probably had several of his teeth knocked out. He's been scourged with a Roman whip, which means that his back has been torn to shreds, to bloody shreds. And he's got this purple robe draped over him being soaked up with the blood of Jesus. He looks like a miserable mess. And yet he is the mockery of a king when Pilate has him sit in the seat that he normally casts judgment. He has Jesus sit there and he says, "You think this guy's a king? Come on. This is no threat to us. This is no threat to me." They're hoping that the Jewish people will look at Jesus and say, "That man's just a foolish idiot that just needs to go home. He doesn't need to be crucified." But that's not what happens. In an amazing hardness of heart, an amazing callousness, we hear the Jewish people call out, "Crucify him. Crucify him." There's an irony in this scene. As Jesus sits in the seat of judgment before all the people, here he is being judged by the people. But there will be one day when Jesus comes to sit in the judgment seat before the people once again, and a few things will be different. He'll be wearing a crown, but it won't be a crown of thorns. It'll be the crown of ages. He'll be decked in righteousness. He'll be sitting before the people, but it won't be the people judging him. It'll be he who judges them. The judge of heaven and earth, here in this scene, in the most pain he's ever been in his life. Finally, I want to look at verse 15, where the Jews say this, "We have no king but Caesar." Those are astounding words for a couple of reasons. First of all, these are the final words that really force Pilate's hand. He understands that if he doesn't crucify Jesus, then he's going to be seen as disloyal to Caesar. That's what's being made clear in these words. They say, "Oh no, Caesar is our king." But what's more remarkable is that it's so shocking to hear this on the lips of Jewish people. Jewish people are supposed to understand, as we read from the book of Samuel earlier, that God alone is their king. They in fact were notoriously rejecting all sorts of governments that have been over them because they say, no, we're Jews and God is our king. And here they have, as they did back in the book of Samuel, rejected their king once more. They have rejected God. They said, "We have no king but Caesar." As I finish today, I just want to point out that what we see in this story are gospel warnings, I think. I think 3 of them, really. 3 responses to Jesus that we can all be caught up in if we're not careful. The first is that of the soldiers. They have sort of a casual rejection of Jesus, a mockery of Jesus, really. They have no interest in what's going on. They're just there doing their job, and they want to have a little fun beating up this guy that's calling himself the King of the Jews. It seems to me there are people in the world that are like that just reject Jesus out of hand, make jokes about him, make light of him. They want nothing to do with Jesus. They just want to go about with their lives. Then there's Pilate. Pilate's an interesting character because on some level he seems to really have an affection for Jesus. He doesn't want Jesus to be crucified. He's interrogating him. He's trying to find out more about him. But in the end, he does ultimately reject Jesus by his actions. And I think there's a danger here too for us that there are some people who do look into the claims of Christ, who do see the beauty and the goodness of Jesus, and yet they're not willing to embrace all that goes along with becoming a disciple, with letting their lives be transformed by him. They'd rather hold on to what they've got than to embrace what Jesus offers them. And then finally, there's the example of the Jewish leaders here. And if I'm honest, I think this is probably the category I have a temptation to fall into the most. These Jewish people knew Jesus. He was one of them. They knew his claims, and yet they preferred their own works to his lordship. And I think sometimes we as Christians can get to a point where we trust too much in our own ability to do our good works, to make our good name for ourselves, rather than rejecting our works and embracing Christ, receiving his grace, trusting in his love. I want to encourage you today, brothers and sisters, if you are harboring any sort of defense of your own life in your heart, let it go. Confess with me, I'm a sinner and I cannot save myself. Lord, I need you. Save me, Lord Jesus, our God, our King. May this word be to the glory of God and for the joy of his people. Amen.